Now I'm going out. Oh, I'm going out, everyone. As if that wasn't happening all the time anyway. Hello. Good evening. Hello, my name is Josephine Baird. You can see a picture there with my name on it, which is very exciting. With lots of graphics that were made by some fabulous people at the department that I work at in Uppsala. Big shout out to them. Two of them are in the front row. I love that my department are here in the front row. It makes me so happy. And some of them are at home, and if you're there, hello. Hello, Lilia. Thank you for the wonderful butterfly. Anyway, hi. My name is Josephine Baird. I work at the Uppsala University Department of Game Design, where I am a lecturer, amongst other things. Here is another slide which describes these things. There's also a picture of me there, just in case you needed to recognize me. It's sort of like my version of an ID card, except for I drew it. So it's one that I like, and I feel good about it, so I promise it's me. Yes, I am a game designer and a consultant, and also a researcher and a lecturer, as I said, at the game design department of Uppsala University on Gotland, which is absolutely lovely. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna, and occasionally make a spectacle of myself on stages like this, or draw funny pictures and put them on the internet, which is my way of saying I'm an artist now and again. These are my credentials, and this is what I'm hopefully allows me to have some perspective on this, because I'm a little nervous today. This is my first Knutpunkt. It's also my first, thank you very much. Oh, that's so exciting. I'm also my first time presenting here, obviously, because otherwise those two things wouldn't go together, really. But it's not my first time being part of a role-play community or a performance community, which is where I really come from, and where I thought I'd start this conversation, if I may. And so I thought I'd start the conversation with a discussion of a role-playing moment that I had, which, when I started working in game design, and when I started specifically working with Larp, I was immediately reminded of. Now, I don't know if this is recognizable to anyone in the room. Yeah, okay. It's somewhat iconic to a few people that I can see knowing smiles here already, which is lovely. Imagine me of a certain age, I shan't tell you what, when that game on the left there originally came out. I'm young, I'm in England, which is a country where, well, I don't know how to describe the relationship to gender and gender conformity, but it looks like this, right? And imagine me trying to sort of like desperately figure out who I am and what I am. And I'm at home, and this game appears in front of me. Now, it's not magical, I went out and bought it, but you know, eventually it was there. And in the middle of this game, my brave warrior who was fighting against capitalism, amongst other things, suddenly appears in this quest, in this RPG, in a precarious situation where he is a cisgender person, he must dress up like a woman. He has no choice. He must do it in order to, I don't know, save the world, basically. And of course, as a good hero, I, who was playing this particular protagonist, thought, if I must, I will throw myself upon this giant sword that he was carrying and do this thing. And it was absolutely thrilling, of course, because it was one of the first times I'd experienced anything like that. I'm not kidding. I was living in a culture where trans really wasn't a thing. It wasn't a word that I was aware of. And suddenly I've been given this experience to inhabit another person, another role. And that was the best part, because it wasn't me saving the world. It wasn't me having to dress convincingly as a woman and suddenly be reflected upon as a woman in this game. It was Cloud. It gave me the perfect excuse and the perfect opportunity to experience this role in this tiny little way. And that was, I think, one of my first experiences of having a role-play moment really give me a sense of what it could do for me as a person, as a trans person, trying to come out in an environment that wasn't really very accommodating. On the right, there is the most recent version of that game. If you're interested, it is a digital game. I apologize. I will mention a couple of digital games now and again, just for interest's sake. But this is the new version of it, and I guarantee you, anybody who's played the original, go play the new one. It is super gay and does not in any way disappoint. And I played it a few times. Over and over again. Okay, I saved it at that point and just kept playing it, because the game itself, this moment, so That's what my talk is going to be about. Role-playing the real, role-playing the thing that is real, and more specifically about my bizarre attempt to try to design intentionally, as opposed to by accident, a game experience, a LARP experience that might do for someone like me what I had in that moment when I was much younger, and I won't say what age. I'm going to start with, and I apologize beforehand, feel free to throw things. Yes, you can see this coming. There's laughter at the front because Sarah Lynn Bowman knows that I'm about to say the words butler and Judith connected to themselves, and I genuinely apologize for any academics in the room. I promise I'm going to make it fun. I am going to avoid talking about Foucault if I can possibly do it, but it might happen. Excuse me. It comes out like a fart. Anyway, I will try to do this in a way that doesn't involve the words Judith and Butler first. Imagine, if you will, that you were born into a society, into a world, and you are cast into a role. The very first thing that happens to you when you come out into this world, you're cast into this role. There's only two available. You're given one of them. You weren't consulted. It was associated to some sort of arbitrary physical assignment that you got, and you didn't have any conversations about this. As you grow up, the rules of the world are taught to you in lots of little ways, over and over again. You know, you're told, you throw like a girl, or be more ladylike. Now, again, England, so imagine that. There might be a bit more modern versions of this, but you're told this over and over again in little ways. Dress like this, you look nicer. Smile more, perhaps. These little lessons that happen over and over again are almost imperceptible. We just don't even consider it. You just say them without thinking about it. You know, that's so girly, it's so pretty. We play these roles because these are roles that are given to us. We don't have any other options. And by doing that, we reproduce the very same rules that were taught to us in regular ways. Now, I tricked you, as a wonderful speaker did the other day on Monday. I loved how he did this. I tricked you because that was Judith Butler. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Judith Butler says this, and it's kind of useful, because she suggested in a very concise way, if imperceptible way, because if you've ever tried to read it, it does hurt the brain somewhat, that gender norms are perpetuated through their performance in everyday life. We reproduce these norms that we were taught just in our little actions, the performance, the social performance. Now, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you could also look at Goffman, who's particularly popular amongst LARP theorists, I found in the last few months of reading it. But for this occasion, I'm going to use Butler because she specifically talks about gender a little bit more. We're taught to do this in, like I said, so many ways that are so subtle that it becomes naturalized. It's normal, it's natural. It's not just normal, it's innate, it's immutable, it can't be changed. We learn this by copying and repeating, and more specifically, we are policed if we don't do it. Now, I ask you, if something is absolutely perfectly normal and natural, would you need the police to tell you not to do it? Yes, I thought so. The result is the heterosexual matrix. This is Butler's term. And amazingly, she came up with it in 1990, right before a certain movie that I particularly like and have referenced several times subtly in my slides. You might have noticed. The heterosexual matrix, with sunglasses on, suggests that gender is normalized and is therefore only binary, as in there's two of them, 0 and 1. It's natural, as I said. It is immutable, as in it can never change. And it's reproduced by this complex intersectional system of structures that are policed by agents of the system. Does it sound subtle and obvious at the same time? That it sounds a little bit like a movie we all like? I hope you all like. At least I hope you've all seen. But the best part about this is, just because we live in a system that is so structured, that is so defined, does not mean we cannot resist it. And this is my favorite bit. I love subversion. I love subversion in games. I love subversion in all things. If I can be subversive and trickster, I can and will at all times. And the other thing that's really important when we look at theory like this is it doesn't mean that just because we're taught this system of gender, that underneath that system, there doesn't exist some sort of authentic experience beyond it. Now, I've listed J. Prosser here, who's a fabulous writer. So if you're ever interested in reading Butler and you just don't want to deal with, the language, read J. Prosser, who's an absolutely wonderful trans author as well, provides an excellent critique of it and does it in English. So in short, using dear old Morpheus, these rules are no different from the rules of a computer system. Some of them can be bent and others can be broken. And that's all the Judith Butler I'm going to throw at you, because next we're going to figure out how we do it. And my favorite way of doing it is role play. And I'm going to start with other theory that is colorful, like this wonderful book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer by Bo Ruberg. And I contend that also role-playing has also been queer. But I'm going to just do a very quick detour again into the digital, because I think this is such a wonderful and enchanting example of how role-playing can be queer, and specifically digital games. When you're tired of LARPing, you can occasionally do one of these little ones. And this one is one of my favorites. This is a game that Bo talks about called Octodad, or Octodad Dadliest Catch. In this particular role-playing game, you are cast as an octopus who, for one reason or another, and it's never quite explained, you must hide yourself in everyday human society by pretending to be a dad in a heterosexual relationship with 2 children. And you must do dad things, like you must mow the lawn and take out the garbage and lift heavy things. But of course, because you're an octopus, you have appendages that are somewhat wobbly and hilarity ensues. Now, Bo points out, isn't this a perfect metaphor for, I don't know, passing? As in pretending to be something that you're not, pretending to inhabit a traditional gender, trying to perform dadness to a point where you will hide in society and not be found out. This is such a beautiful way of seeing this role-playing game. What's interesting, though, is Octodad was not designed as a passing simulator, but I contend that anybody who actually plays that game from now on will only see it that way, because it really kind of is. And that's the beauty of queering games, queering activities that weren't necessarily designed to be queered, but isn't that what we do as our queer little selves? We go into places and go, oh, that wasn't really for us. Can we fuck with it? Which is like, again, my favorite thing to do. I think we established that just moments ago. Analog games and LARP do the same thing. And this is where I get embarrassed, because I'm actually going to be citing people who are in the room, people who I haven't met, some people I have met. And it's very odd because, as I said, I'm brand new to LARP. I'm brand new to this beautiful, wonderful community that I've just joined. And of course, I found it through dear friends and colleagues in the middle of the pandemic. And I was like, great, this wonderful experience that we can enjoy together in Zoom calls and not really happen. So what shall I do? I'll read about it, because I am a nerdy student and that's what I do. And I went and I studied this. So what I'm doing is presenting to you some ideas that I found in the literature. And what I'm going to do is try and apply it to this, as I said, odd project that I've come up with. So similar to the video game theorists that I mentioned, which are Chang and Ruberg, studies by role-play theorists, some of whom are in the audience, have suggested that queering role-playing games that weren't necessarily designed for us is something that queer people do all the time too. And I imagine, and I think I see some people in the audience who already know what I'm talking about. In fact, I know a few of you do. I like to take that idea a little bit further, specifically because I'm working with a wonderful group who I mentioned at the beginning at Uppsala University, looking at the possibility of dealing with or examining role-playing and live role-playing games as opportunities for transformative experiences. Remember what I said about Cloud. I had this moment. I role-played this character. I had this experience that I couldn't have possibly imagined in any other way, because my environment wouldn't have allowed for it. The experience of inhabiting this role and having this opportunity allowed me to experience something that was transformative. LARPs allow us to reproduce complex social structures things that are really, really difficult to model otherwise, even in ways that digital games can't and other games can't, and allow us to inhabit those, to role play within them and to experience them in lots of different ways that I think, and I'm very glad to be amongst colleagues who believe the same, are possibly transformative. Now, how do we do that? Well, in my reading and personal experience, I've found a few things that seem to be common. One of them is Larps allow us to rehearse, oh, hello, I think I went loud then. Larps allow us to rehearse difference. Moira Turkington looks at how Larps can be a practice at trying out a different thing. Remember what I was saying before? I'm in my bedroom, repressed as hell, because I'm in England. I mean, England just does that to people in general. But I mean, more specifically, it's true, it really is. It's tragic. But in this particular case, I had this opportunity to rehearse, to try something out, to literally try out an experience that I thought I had. I thought I was a cis boy. I didn't know what cis was by then. But I was like, I'm a boy, but I really want to be this girl. I could try this out. I could rehearse it, right? Well, there are Larps that have been examined in exactly that way. Now, one obvious example is Melon Himmelokov, which here isn't necessarily actually about rehearsing a difference that is positive, which is interesting, right? Because that particular Larp wasn't actually about providing numerous options. In fact, the options that were provided were just as strict as other gender roles in everyday life. But they did offer the alternative to rehearse something different, a different kind of gender. In fact, it provided an option to experience something that was actually kind of difficult, problematic, something that provided friction. Now, in the game that I had, I experienced a wonderful experience. I experienced Cloud having this wonderful moment of being seen as the woman that I knew I was. But in this particular instance, the reports were that several of the individuals were shaken by their experience, saddened by it, because it was so difficult. But they had the opportunity to consider something, to reflect. And that's something that I'm going to come back to too, because as we're rehearsing, we also reflect on our experience. Another Larp that's often brought up is Mad About a Boy, which is based on an experience where gender is now completely different. This is a world in which men have completely disappeared, right? And women exist almost exclusively. And suddenly the last man on earth is found, or not the last man, but it's a man is suddenly found. Again, requires a reflection, a consideration of how the world could be different. How could you structure the world differently? In fact, the groups who are initially set up are singular gendered environments where it's like, okay, now the rules are different. Okay, so the strictures that existed before don't have to be the way they were in our otherwise real lives, right? So now we're rehearsing an opportunity to change, an opportunity to consider what would life be like if it wasn't this. Now, the explicit goal of the game wasn't necessarily to explore gender for trans people per se, but I had argued it provided quite the opportunity nonetheless, right? And the last one I just want to talk about is Just a Little Lovin', which I know has been covered a number of occasions, even this week already, right? But what I thought was really interesting as I was reading through the script book and talking about people who've played the game is the experiences of people who were able to embody queer experiences, not just experiences that were coded as like, well, this is a gender that is slightly different from the one that you are in your world, or it's a fantastical world, but actually explicitly performing and rehearsing an identity, and embodying an identity, being an identity that might be different from the one they have now, or even different from the one I thought I had now. Am I closer to the one that I've just been playing? Is this me? Can I explore this? And we start seeing where the I and the character start to mix, right? There are opportunities here. So when I'm reading about these wonderful Larps that I have as yet not enjoyed on a personal level, talking to people who've experienced them, I keep hearing these stories of transformative experiences of like, I got to do something, I got to rehearse difference, I got to deal with these difficult feelings in environments that felt somehow safer, but still really fucking sad, right? Or really elatory joyful. And made me think about myself. So why and how does that work? Now, I'm a theorist, so I'm going to pick apart things, and that's how I try to figure stuff out. It's partly about how my brain works. And it's partly because I was able to have experiences as a queer person, as a trans person, finding my way through different communities, through different games specifically, but I did it by accident. I did it by pure fucking luck. I came across Final Fantasy. When I came out, I finally met other queer people who made performative, wonderful, play-like environments that looked an awful lot like Larp, and by the way, we're going to come back to that later. And I did it by accident. So this is me starting to try to figure this out. And please tell me if I get this wrong. You can come up to me afterwards, or if we have time, I'm not sure, I'm checking the time, to ask me about this, because I'm really curious. But this is my attempt to try to figure this out. So, one of the things that I've noticed in the conversations that I've had with people who've played these games, in the reading that I've done, in the LARPs that I've experienced, the designing I've done so far, is that one of the things that is the most critical when you're having an experience and you're trying to figure out how that might relate to who you are as a person is reflexivity. As I was saying before, when you're rehearsing that difference, when you're trying out something new, you're reflecting on yourself, right? You're not just reflecting on the person you're playing, who is this character, what are they like? You're reflecting on how that character relates to yourself. LARPs use lots of different techniques outside of just the game in order to do this. I'm sure you've experienced some of these, workshops, act breaks, meta techniques, to emphasize this. My colleague Sarah, who's sitting right there, and I wrote out your name in full because I do like you so much, and I really do find it really odd when you write Bowman at 2013, and especially when they're in the audience. I knew some of you were going to be here. Sorry, internal monologue. Talks about how this process works in terms of different options that happen, that you can take off social roles that you have in your everyday life, that you can perform new identities and then return to the self that you had before, but perhaps with a new consideration. And I argue that's through reflection and through consideration of the character, but how that character relates to yourself. And how that happens is through, I'm sure, a term that you all know, bleed. But we've been talking a little bit about what bleed actually is and what term we should use for it. Then there's lots of different versions of bleed that two of theorists right here again in the front have discussed in great detail. One of my favorite examples of the way bleed is discussed by a trans player is by Joan Moriarty, who wrote this wonderful little article, and I believe it appears in the Washington Post of all places, which is just fabulous, right? And talks about how role-playing games specifically allowed her to come out as trans. It's not just like, oh, I got to explore something different and it considered, you know, it led me to certain understandings and then I read books and went to clubs. No, this is very flat out saying, this role-playing experience allowed me to do this. And then she uses terms specifically related to the experience of the reflexivity that she had by playing a different character of a different gender in a game, what that meant to her, and then more specifically, what experience she could take out of that game and apply to herself in her everyday life. She could explore a different gender, find that it meant something to herself, that she could discard the role that she had been cast off as cast at birth, learn, you know, rehearse a new role, find that it matched something in herself, and then take that out of the game and be that in everyday life. That, to me, is pure fucking magic. It really, really is, and means the world to me, to experience, to see in others, and that's why I'm doing this work and why I'm interested in it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple ideas, and then I'm going to come to my own little project and why I'm looking at this in the way that I am. Again, my dear colleagues at the Uppsala University, Sarah and Shell, wrote an amazing article about transformative experiences of games, which I highly recommend you read. And they discuss this notion of a container, that a LARP experience can be a transformational container. It's a space, right? Remember what I was saying. I went into a game and it was safer than the environment that I was in, right? The game wasn't the social environment that was, right? Remember the uptight lemon face experience? it wasn't that. It provided an opportunity, but it didn't just provide an opportunity. It didn't just provide a moment for reflection. It provided a safer moment for that. It wasn't as dangerous as the environment that I was in prior. That's why we talk about safety. That's why it's so important. But it also was a space in which I could genuinely consider these things. Now, they talk about this notion of considering LARPs as containers that contain features that would allow for that are specifically designed for these experiences, or at least considered that way, because it is very difficult to design for this. I am very, very well aware of, as I've started to try to design my own little versions of this. But I really like the idea of considering these things as containers. And in a moment, I will give you an example of why I think those transformational containers are a particularly good idea, a good way of considering designing for this kind of experience. But one of the aspects that these containers allow, and why they are safer places to experience these transformative moments, is because they give an alibi. Remember I said that Cloud didn't, it wasn't me that had to dress up like a woman and save the world. It was Cloud who did that. Cloud had to do this, and he had no choice, you see. There was no other ways of doing this. He must desperately dress in a ball gown and be fabulous. I mean, there is no choice in that game. You just must be makeup too. It's just, you must be this gorgeous, and you must be this just perfect, right? It just has to happen, right? It's a wonderful fucking excuse for a British school child going, oh dear God, could it be? No, but here it can, right? That's an aspect of it. And the other things that they talk about a lot, which I really like, when we talk about how we can take that experience in a container and out into the real world, is about communities, like this one, that I'm just meeting now. Some of the people I just met over dinner and was struggling to get out of to come do this talk because I was having these amazing conversations and people just saying hello. Is these communities that allow you to take out the experience that you're having in the container, outside of that container, and continue to contain it in another way, in another environment. And that is through communities. Now, I don't have the time to go into more of that, but I will at some point, because I think this is a critical aspect of what we do, and I think it's sometimes... And did you see how I did that? I said, what we do. I included myself. Oh, I feel so good. Thank you. Oh, I'm having a journey. Oh. Sorry. Anyway, I think this is a critical part of what we're talking about. And I'll tell you why in just a minute, because we've got another slide, and I forgot I had this one. Because it allows for role reflection outside of an experience that just happens in the moment, right? One of the most important things in psychology theory, and now, when I first started as an academic, I did study psychology. I apologize. I like to think of myself as a lapsed psychologist, and that's a joke I tell every now and again because it's funnier to me than it is to anybody else. But one of the things that I learned in psychology was one of the most fundamental aspects of having an identity, especially one that you are able to retain and one that you can be uncomfortable in, is that it's reflected back at you, right? So it's not just that you're reflecting to yourself in that moment. It's not just that you're considering your character like I was in my own little room, right, with Cloud playing on my screen. It was that the experience was being reflected back at me, that my identity was being reflected back at me, myself was being reflected back at me. Now, for a moment, in that Final Fantasy example, it happened because my little character is running around the screen, and as I'm running around, all the NPCs are suddenly shouting, oh, who's that beautiful, delightful, ball-gowned wearing woman? And I had this moment of reflection of like, oh my God, this identity is being reflected back at me. But it's still minor, digital, momentary. In our everyday lives, in order to retain our sense of selves, one of the most important things is having that reflected back at it. It's why we have our pronouns on here. It's why it's an issue. It's why it's a stress and it's such a horrific experience when we have to argue for it. Because we just want to hear that our identities are respected and reflected. And transformational containers, LARPs, communities, can not only allow for that to happen in a game, but it can allow for it to happen outside of the game. And that's really, really critical. And if you want to look at studies by the completely obvious, there are universities that say, well, it's funny how actually if you look at trans people, if they have their identities respected, they seem to be happier. I'll allow that to sink in for a minute. If you need, there are actual people up here that do say that, but I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, does it need to be said? And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about thin characters, and here's two people who look very similar, one next to each other. Remember, I was talking about this notion of playing somebody who is sort of like yourself, that's sort of similar to who you are. The difficulty when you're playing a character who is very, very different from yourself is that the alibi or even the character can be so distant that you wouldn't necessarily consider themselves similar. And so one of the questions that I came across in my studies as well as my discussions was, how can we think about characters for people who are trying to explore these senses of self that are close enough to an identity that they believe they might have, right? Before they know that they have it. Now, a thin character is someone that is very similar to yourself. It's like I played a character called Josephine, Baird, who is a lecturer in game playing, who currently lives in Sweden, Gothenburg, rather than Gotland, right? That is a way to rehearse something, but how do you actually create a game or experience for somebody who doesn't know that they need to have that experience yet? How can a thin character exist yet? Well, that's part of the pitfalls. It's one of the difficulties when you're studying these things, is to figure out how can we create these environments, how can we make these spaces. These experiences I've talked about have been covered in the theory that I've been glossing over and is above here. And I'll share slides if you're interested, because this is the theory I've been reading. It's all up there, but these are experiences that I know a lot of people have had. They're experiences I've had, but there are difficulties to these things. They don't just happen, and they aren't just uncomplicated. Because the other thing that I've talked to when I've talked to trans Larpers, trans players, trans role players is that we still live in a transphobic society. We still live in a society that doesn't necessarily deal with gender great. So we're always going to be a little bit nervous about our environments. How can you create a game or a game space that is completely free of those things? And should you? And how can you mitigate that? Other issues, like I said, have to do with how can you create a thin character for somebody who doesn't even know yet that they want to have that experience. These are the questions that I'm asking myself and having conversations with my colleagues as I'm trying to deal with the notion that perhaps trans games can be really, LARPs can be really good for us as trans players, or even players who just want to explore gender. But the thing is, there are lots of places where I've already experienced this. Like I said, I've had play experiences that have had this happen. There are movies that I was seeing in 1999, even before I was coming out, that weirdly enough seemed to speak to me for some reason and seemed to help me to imagine this possibility that might provide some of the answers to the questions I just put up. How do we design a transformational container that allows for someone to experience a character that's thin enough in relation to an identity they don't know if they want yet, in an environment that might also be transphobic, that might also allow for enough alibi that they can play the character in the first place, but isn't too much alibi that it's so different from them that they can't even imagine being themselves outside of the game, and well, there might not even be a community there in the end after all. So, well, there's an experience that I had where, weirdly enough, we were kind of doing this by accident. Charlie's laughing. Hi, Charlie. This picture wasn't taken that long after I met Charlie. This was in 2007 rather than 2004. Queer communities that I happened to luck upon in London were incredibly creative, and more specifically, exceptionally performative. We would perform anything, and we still do, because we have no shame. And we, it's true, we really don't. But also because it was one of the only places in which we could talk about experiences that didn't get discussed anywhere else. One of the things that is so difficult about having an identity that isn't in the mainstream or is even rejected by the mainstream is there aren't even really words for your experiences. There aren't even really terms for them. There might be pejoratives, there might be insults thrown at you, but there aren't words for what we experience. And yet, the language that I found for my experience, the opportunities to role play and perform and to experiment and to embody my gender in all the weird and wonderful ways I thought it might exist, happened in nightclubs. And one club that I particularly found myself in over and over again was called Whatever. And whatever, as you can imagine by the name, stands for sir, madam, whatever. Anybody's welcome. It wasn't an LGBTQ club. It wasn't a club specifically for queer people. It was for everybody. And when I was coming out, or trying to desperately, I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know what I needed to experience in order to find out who I was. But I went to this fabulous club. And when I was there, I found the most amazing performers. Now, as I said, the thing that I do when I want to learn about something is that I'm too scared to initially go and experience it. The pandemic gave me an excellent alibi to not just jump into Larp because I'm a scaredy cat. It gave me a perfect alibi to go read about it. Now, can you imagine, again, British me, all queer as fuck, standing there going, and thinking, I really want to be amongst the queers, but I can't possibly do that. So I read about them in libraries instead, right up until the point where I actually managed to finally get out to a club. And now imagine British little me in the school library going, oh my God, these people exist. There are pictures in this book. Like the Drag King book by Del Grace Volcano, like, and then one day I went to this place called Whatever because my friends dragged me to it, and there they all were, all of them in Technicolor magic, and it was absolutely astounding. And the very same night that I went, the promoter, who was desperately looking for performers, came up to me and said, "Hi, you're Josephine," and I said, "Yes." "I hear you dance," and I was like, "Occasionally." "When?" "Well, we have a slot next week. Would you mind?" "Great, see you, bye." And off they went. And suddenly I was booked to perform at the very next Whatever that I attended. And I did. And it was one of the most exceptional experiences that I've ever had. And I'll never forget it. And it was because I chose to perform a dance piece, and not necessarily a comedy piece, but a dance piece. And I just performed this experience. I didn't have a word for it. It was just like, I'm angry and sad, and I don't get to be who I want to be in life, and it makes me feel like shit. I don't have the words for it, but I know how to make it look, and this is it. And suddenly I finished, and the music stops, and I've done my dance, and I'm like crying, and I'm sweaty as fuck, and all these queers are suddenly looking at me, reflecting this experience back at me. What have I just done? I've just performed, I've just role-played, I've just inhabited. I've been given the alibi by the space that I am in. The doors to Whatever closed, and the outside world stayed there, and the transformational container was inside. And I could be myself, even without words, even without going, I'm trans, or I'm queer, or I'm gay. I had no fucking idea I was this, remember? And I could just express it, and I could get a response, I could get reflection, I could get identity something, psychology theory, ... Right? Exactly, thank you. Because I forgot. Thank you, Sarah. Validated. A couple of months later, because of course immediately I started working with Whatever because it was the best place I knew, and I just wanted to have that experience over and over again. We decided to create the dressing up corner. And the dressing up corner worked like this. You come into the club, this queer club in London. You don't know what it is. It sounds fun. It's Whatever. It appears in Time Out magazine. Looks like a club I should go to. Sure, I'll go in. And as you walk in, there's a little clothes rail and this hand-painted sign that says dressing up corner. And up there by the little hand-painted sign is a very friendly person going, hello, in a very British way, hello. And you're invited to wear something different from the clothes rail, which are all clothes that were either donated by people from our community or we just got at the secondhand store. And there was makeup. And our little friendly hello person would help you put the makeup on if you wanted. And then the rule was this. You can now be whoever you've dressed up as for the rest of the night. And that person can be in this club, and they'll be responded to in whatever way you want. Because whatever, remember? And then that person just goes about the club, and suddenly they're this other creature. Now, at the end of the night, they'd come back to the dressing up corner, because it's right by the door. And we had another rule, which was, you're very welcome to take everything off and leave it here if you want. Or, option 2, you can take it with you. Because these are all donated. And as you walk out the door, if you take it with you, maybe you'd like to leave something behind that you'd worn on the way in for somebody else. And invariably, we had people do exactly that. Now, have you seen where I'm going with all this? The doors to the club provides the container, right? It's a queer club. It's fabulous. Of course I'm going to wear makeup when I get there. That's what you do when you're in a queer club. Of course I'm straight and cis and, all those good things. But I was in the queer club, so it doesn't matter. Alibi. Well, I'll be this person for a little while. I don't know who they are. Potentially thin character, maybe, maybe not. I get reflected back at me because I have my name tag on and I'm that person for the night and I'm going to be fabulous and I'm going to dance and I'm going to meet people and they're going to reflect back at me whoever I say I am for that moment. And I can perform and I can role play and I can embody and I can be whoever the hell you want to be. One night I was Lara Croft, I shit you not. There's video evidence and I did it once and I decided not the role for me. And at the end of the night, you reach the threshold of our container and you're given that choice. And it's really chill. Again, remember, hello. She's not going to be at you to make you make a particular decision. You can choose to take something with you, bleed into the rest of the world, and potentially also leave something behind, which is something very special. Because it wasn't just that you were leaving behind an element of yourself or a piece of clothing, you were leaving behind an opportunity for the next person to have the very same experience you just had. And we had no words for what the hell we were doing because, like I said, we weren't thinking about these things. We were just trying to have experiences. We were trying to talk about who we were in the moment, at the time, trying to find a way to be ourselves. Because that's why the club's called whatever. We don't have a word for this. Queer? Yes. Trans? Maybe. Whatever. Because that experience needed to be found in that way. This is the bleed for me between performance and LARP. And that's why when I found LARP, I felt like I was coming home to something. I recognized it. I was like, I know what this is. And then when I was talking to my dear colleagues who are sitting here, Sarah, Shell, and Josephine, I was like, no, it isn't just an experience that you can have. It's a transformational experience. And I'd like to have more of that, please. And I'd like to do it on purpose. I'd like to stop doing it by accident, right? I'd like to stop lucking into it. I'd like to try and make this. Now, I was a PhD student for the second time in my life. Long story, we won't go into it. We can if you want, over beverages. And I started off with this idea of like, I want to look at games and what opportunities they can provide for trans people because I know what opportunities it gave for me. And I was looking at video games and I was thinking about those. And then when I came across LARP, I was like, oh my God. Now don't get me wrong, I think there are digital ways that we can do this. And funnily enough, the experiences we've all just had, and even myself, I have LARPed a little bit online, have shown us that digital ways can be incorporated. But there was something particular about this that I found recognizable and a true opportunity. And it led me to these questions, and some of them I've asked already tonight. And I would go over them, but I got a little bit of time left. And what I'd rather do, if you don't mind, you can read these if you like, because, if you're an academic and if you're lecturers, you're always reading the slides anyway. And I'm happy to give them to you, as I said. But I'd rather talk to you about this weird idea I have, which is to make a game based on something that a lot of people know. Now, one of the things that I've discovered through my reading and experiences and discussions is that Larps and games, we iterate on experiences that we recognize. The Matrix is a series of films made by 2 trans women. And if you ever watch the first one especially, or the whole series, you would, well, again, remember, I was not out, and I hadn't got any words for it yet. But the first time I saw that movie, I was like, wow, they're flying around, but it's making me feel funny things. And I went and watched it again, and I was like, what is this feeling? There are these people who come out of pods, and they look different than the way they did in the system that they were in just before, and that system was really oppressive, and now they're out of it. They're having experiences that they're trying to find themselves, and they're helping other people to have similar experiences. That sounds like an experience that I recognize, funnily enough. And then it turns out, of course, that the people who made it are trans, and that the films are all about being trans, everyone. They just are. But they're films that we recognize. They provide a sense of recognition. They provide a sense of connection, something that we know. So I thought, now here's an idea for some kind of experience. Can I design something that is legally just dissimilar enough from that idea that I'm not going to get sued, but recognizable enough that would give someone the opportunity to explore a gender outside their own? And so for now, I'm trying to borrow ever so gently from the Wachowskis a world to make a game that I would hope help people to explore an alternative, to come out of a system into an environment that might be transformative, that might allow them to explore something new. Now, I'm inspired by many of the Larps I just mentioned, other worlds that provide us an opportunity to consider something different, structures that provide us an opportunity to reflect. So that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm trying to make. And I'm doing it with some wonderful colleagues who feel the same way, inspired by some literature written by the people in this room, inspired by a community that I found that I recognize and have been deeply moved by and already feel a part of. And that's what I'm trying to do with this weird thing that I call a PhD, but really I just call my life. So thank you for listening. Okay, now we're awkward. Thank you. I don't know. Have I ended early or late, or is there a question and situation? Should I run away? I'm looking at these people who are looking at the tech. By the way, hi universe out there. There are lovely people who are making this happen. I'm very excited to be beamed out to you, and I have no idea who you are, but thank you. I'll be around to chat if you'd like. I'd love to hear thoughts. I'm always keen to talk to anybody who might have thoughts on what I'm trying to do, especially because I feel really nervous. So, thanks.